Working with gradients in Illustrator is great fun because there's so many ways you can use them, and it's very easy to edit and save them as well. Let me select the background in this illustration, and instead of having this flat mint color, I would like to introduce a nice subtle gradient here. Now, to make it easier to see what's happening, first I'm going to turn off the design elements, and we will just see this rectangle on its own. Now there's two different ways you can apply a gradient, actually even more, but these are the two ways that I normally use. You can go to the gradient panel and you can apply a gradient from here. You can pick one of the default gradients, or you can also just click on the slider. That's one of the ways you can start with a gradient. You can also use the gradient tool, which we will come back to. That's G on the keyboard if you want to quickly access it, by the way. And the gradient tool will be very handy. But you can also apply gradients from the swatches. Here you can also find a couple of default gradients you can choose from. But let's stick to the most basic one, the black and white linear gradient. Once this is selected, I go back to the gradient panel and we can see the options available for us. First of all, what we can do is to decide how this gradient should be applied on this shape. Whether we want it linear or radial. Radial looks like this and linear looks like that. No matter what type of gradient you use, you can always reverse the gradient, so change the direction very quickly. But let's just stick to white to black at the moment. Now, the transition from white to black can be controlled with this center point, and that is almost like balancing how much color you want to use. So a bit more of the white or a bit more of the black. That's the midpoint of the transition between these two color stops. They call them color stops, and they can be also changed. You can also call them sliders. So if we double click on it, we can pick a color, and then we can double click on the other one and we can pick another color. Now once again, changing the center point or midpoint can change how much of each color is going to be used in this gradient. And of course, even these sliders can be moved around easily. Below this slider, you can see the exact location of each of these color stops. So there's a percentage there. But you can also control the opacity. So if I reduce it, it will become more see-through. Currently, we are just seeing the white artboard, but it's actually a see-through gradient. And just to prove that to you, if I drag it further up, you can see how it fades into the gray background. I will just undo this, and I will undo the change on opacity as well. Just remember, it's something you can also do to change the opacity of each of the color stops. But the same way as you move the currently available stops, you can also click under the slider to add a new color stop. And by default, it's going to be using exactly the same shade that currently was there in the transition. But then once I double click on it, I can change that also to something else. You can have as many color stops as you want in one gradient. And once you have the colors roughly that you wish to use, I would recommend to switch to the gradient tool, because the rest of the features are easier to use with that. Instead of changing the angle in the gradient panel, what you can do is to click and drag to change the direction and the spread of your gradient. So when you drag just a short line, it's going to be a very abrupt transition. When you stretch it out further, then it's going to be a much smoother gradient. You can of course go beyond the actual shape and in any different angles. And similarly, when you use radial gradients, you will have the same effect but in a circular way. So in this case, you actually define the radius of your gradient. So you can decide where you want to start it and how far you want to spread it out. With radial gradients, we have an additional option, and that is the aspect ratio. So currently it's a perfect circle, but it can be squeezed into more of an elliptical shape. Now there's a very important thing that you need to remember. If the object you're currently working on is within a group, you can't actually see the gradient annotator tool, which is very useful. So if that ever happens to you, you have to make sure from the layers you select the path itself on which you are applying the gradient and not the group. Once the path is selected, as you can see, also don't forget, don't click on the name, click on the little circle next to it. That's how you highlight an object. So once you have the individual object selected, you will not only see the gradient, but also this thing called Gradient Annotator tool. By the way, it can also be hidden. So if you can't see it, maybe it's because it's hidden. From the view menu, you can find it here, Gradient Annotator, and there's even a shortcut for showing and hiding it. Now, let's just say now we can see it finally. So what can we do with it? Well, first of all, we can very easily reposition it. So instead of redrawing it, I can move it around. In case of a radial gradient, we can squeeze it. So change the aspect ratio of it, just like that. We can also resize it very quickly, make it smaller or bigger. And of course, we can adjust the color stops as well on it. And that's probably the best thing about using this annotator. So we can do it directly on the object itself. Even the midpoints can be adjusted. Plus you can also double click and change the actual colors. You can of course also add new color stops on the annotator and then change the color there. If you don't want to use a color stop anymore, you can just drag it away from the annotator. The same thing applies here as well. If you have a color stop that you don't need anymore, just drag it down. And then let me switch to the linear gradient, where you will see again the same thing. So you have your annotator and you can see all the color stops on it. And of course, you can change the size of the gradient. If you go slightly away from the annotator, you can also change the angle of it very quickly. I just prefer to redraw it, to be honest, in case of a linear gradient. Now, once you have a gradient created that you wish to use, you can also save it as a swatch. And all you have to do is to go to the swatches panel and simply click on the new icon. That's going to create the new gradient swatch. So let me turn back the design that we have here. Now, if I want, I can always switch back to the original color or something similar and then check how it looks with the gradient. And then of course I can keep using the gradient tool, so I can create a different transition from top to bottom or from bottom to top and so on and so forth. So there's many different things you can do once you set up the gradient. Now there's one last thing I would like to mention, and that is you can also use gradients on strokes. Now, just to prove this to you, I'm going to create a circle quickly here. And instead of using a gradient on the fill of this, I'm going to swap the gradient onto the stroke attribute. If you remember, that's the Shift X shortcut. And I'm going to hold down Shift and increase the size of this stroke. So now we can see it being applied here. And to make it easier to see it, I'm just going to drag it away from the actual design itself. So there you go, we have our gradient on the stroke. And in these cases, when the stroke attribute is selected, here in the gradient panel, you can also control how you want the gradient to be applied. And you can see we have three different options. The first one is going to apply the gradient as if the stroke was actually an object. But in these cases, the gradient tool can't be used to change the direction. So you will have to use the angle from the panel. And you won't be able to stretch the gradient beyond the actual boundaries of the object. So it's a little bit more constrained than using a gradient on the fill attribute. But we have two other options as well. We have the apply gradient along the stroke, where there will be a visible start and end point. And then there's the third one as well, where the gradient is going to be applied from center out or from the outside in, depending on how you look at it. So this is what we call across the stroke. The first one was within the stroke, and the second one in the middle is called along the stroke. So let's just see these side by side, just so it's a little bit easier to memorize. I'm going to create three versions, and I will apply them in the order we have it here in the gradient panel. So that is within stroke, the second is along stroke, and the third one is across the stroke. And I'm going to increase the stroke a little bit even more just so we can have a really good look at it. And you can imagine that there's a lot of possibilities once you start working with gradients. We are going to keep using them in the following chapters, but in the next video, we will talk about a very important panel, the appearance panel, where we can not only keep track of all the changes to the appearance of objects, but also create much more complex combinations of using multiple strokes and fills and even effects.